Every country on Earth owes money. But to whom? The United States owes $38 trillion. Japan, $9 trillion. The world altogether owes $315 trillion, or about 336% of global GDP, according to the IMF. That means humanity now owes more money than it has ever created. But here's the paradox. If everyone is in debt, who's the creditor? The answer isn't a single person or secret cabal. It's a mechanism, a financial architecture built step by step over 3 centuries. 4 men, each in a different era, designed parts of it. A Scottish merchant, a German banker, an American tycoon, and a U.S. Federal Reserve chairman. Together, they engineered a world where money itself is born from borrowing, and debt can never truly be repaid. It began as a war loan. It evolved into a market. It became a global operating system. Today, we live inside that system, where every dollar, every euro, every yen exists because someone, somewhere, owes it back with interest. This isn't conspiracy theory. It's public record, from 1694's Bank of England charter to the Fed's balance sheet today. If the world ever paid off its debt, 2/3 of all money would vanish overnight. So the system keeps borrowing, and the interest never stops flowing. If you've ever wondered why governments can't balance their budgets or why every financial crisis ends with more debt than before, subscribe to Retro Finance. Because what you're about to see isn't a mistake in the system, it is the system. Before 1694, debt was temporary. A king borrowed from merchants, paid interest for a few years, then repaid or defaulted. The slate cleared. Money ended where promises ended. But that changed when William Paterson, a failed Scottish trader, made a desperate proposal to England's king. England was broke after years of war with France. The treasury was empty, the credit of the crown destroyed. Paterson's solution was radical. A group of private merchants would lend £1.2 million to the government, about 10% of England's GDP. But the principal would never be repaid. In exchange, the government would pay 8% annual interest forever, backed by tax revenue. To manage it, Paterson founded a new institution, the Bank of England. Merchants deposited gold. The bank lent it to the crown. The government's IOU became the bank's asset, and the bank issued paper notes backed by that IOU. Those notes circulated as money. For the first time, debt itself became currency. A century later, Nathan Rothschild turned it global. He didn't just lend to governments, he created markets for their debt. During the Napoleonic Wars, Rothschild learned that information moved faster than armies. When he received early news of Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo, he used it to manipulate London's bond market. He sold British bonds, triggered panic, then bought them back for half price. When victory was announced, bond prices soared, and Rothschild became the richest man in Europe. He had just demonstrated a new law of finance. Whoever controls credit and information controls nations. From that moment on, debt was no longer local or moral. It was structural. It fueled railways, wars, and empires. And by the 20th century, it would evolve again, into a system where governments could create money simply by issuing new debt. Paterson made the debt permanent. Rothschild made it profitable. And together, they laid the foundation for the world we live in, where borrowing isn't a flaw in the economy. It's the engine of it. Before the 17th century, public borrowing was personal. Kings borrowed from merchants. Merchants demanded repayment. When a kingdom defaulted, creditors lost everything. The books were wiped, and the cycle began again. Then, in 1694, one Scottish merchant changed the rules of civilization. William Paterson, a failed trader and financial visionary, approached King William III with a desperate proposal. England was at war with France. The treasury was empty. Tax revenues barely covered payroll for soldiers. Paterson's plan: raise £1.2 million, about £300 million today, roughly 10% of England's GDP, from wealthy merchants. But here was the twist. The loan would never be repaid. Instead, the government would pay 8% annual interest, £96,000 a year, forever. The merchants agreed because the interest was guaranteed by Parliament and backed by taxes. In return, Paterson founded a new institution to manage it, the Bank of England. Here's how it worked. Step by step, merchants deposited their gold into the new bank. The bank lent that gold to the crown. The crown issued an IOU to the bank. The bank used that IOU as collateral to issue paper banknotes to the public. Those paper notes could be traded like cash. For the first time, the government's debt became the nation's money. It was revolutionary. Before 1694, money had to be mined, minted, or seized. After 1694, money could simply be borrowed into existence. Within a generation, England's national debt skyrocketed, from £1 million in 1688 to £16 million by 1702, a 16-fold leap. The government was paying millions in annual interest, yet the principal never shrank. In 1751, these perpetual loans were consolidated into instruments called consols, bonds with no maturity date, paying interest indefinitely. Britain carried portions of that same debt until 2015. Paterson died without a fortune, but his system outlived empires. The Bank of England still issues currency backed by government debt, and taxpayers still fund interest payments that never end. In a single stroke, Paterson turned debt from a burden into the foundation of modern finance. From that moment on, as long as the government could tax its citizens, interest would flow. And so it has, for more than 3 centuries. A century later, another man would supercharge Paterson's design. He didn't invent debt, he industrialized it. Nathan Rothschild, a German banker operating from London, turned national borrowing into a global market. His family had already established 5 banking houses across Europe: Frankfurt, Paris, Vienna, Naples, and London, creating the first truly international financial network. When Europe erupted in the Napoleonic Wars, that network became the lifeline of nations. Britain needed gold to pay its armies on the continent. Rothschild's couriers moved bullion faster than governments could ship it. In 1815 alone, his agents transferred over £10 million in gold, an amount larger than Britain's entire wartime budget a generation earlier. But Rothschild's real genius wasn't logistics, it was market engineering. Instead of simply lending money to governments, he bought their war bonds at a discount, then resold them to investors across Europe at a markup. He didn't just finance debt, he created a secondary market for it. Here's what that meant in practice. The British government might issue a £100 bond to raise cash for the war. Rothschild would purchase it for £60 or £70 when panic gripped the markets, then sell it for £100 or £105 when victory felt certain. Each cycle made him millions, but it also made sovereign debt liquid, tradable, and permanent. The most famous instance came at Waterloo. Rothschild's courier network brought news of Napoleon's defeat a full day before official dispatches reached London. He began selling British bonds in public view, spreading fear that Britain had lost. Prices collapsed. Then, in secret, his agents bought up the same bonds at fire sale prices. When victory was announced, those bonds soared in value, and Rothschild's fortune exploded overnight. That wasn't insider trading by modern definition. It was information arbitrage, and it changed finance forever. By 1830, the Rothschild houses controlled more than 40% of Europe's sovereign debt issuance. Governments from Prussia to Austria borrowed through them because no one else could move money across borders so efficiently. But this efficiency came with a hidden consequence. Default became impossible. Before Rothschild, a king who refused to pay his creditors caused a local crisis. After Rothschild, default meant disaster for half the continent, because those same bonds sat in the vaults of French, German, and Austrian banks. One missed payment could crash the entire network. Paterson had made debt permanent. Rothschild made it interconnected. By tying nations together through shared creditors, he ensured that the cost of default was greater than the cost of obedience. It was the birth of a global web of credit, and the first time in history that money moved faster than armies, and finance replaced conquest as the tool of empire. By the early 1900s, America was booming, but unstable. Banks operated independently, each issuing its own credit. The nation had no central authority to manage the money supply. When confidence fell, markets crashed. In 1907, they nearly took the U.S. economy with them. The panic started with a failed stock speculation. Within weeks, depositors lined up outside banks demanding their savings. Cash vanished. Interest rates spiked. Entire cities teetered on collapse. Then one man, John Pierpont Morgan, stepped in. He locked New York's leading bankers inside his private library, forced them to pool their own money, and declared which institutions would live or die. Over a tense 48 hours, he injected $25 million of his own funds to stabilize markets, a fortune equivalent to nearly $800 million today. It worked. The panic ended. Morgan was hailed as a national savior, and privately the bankers realized something vital. Next time, they needed a system, not a savior. 3 years later, that system was drafted in secret. In November 1910, 6 of the nation's most powerful financiers, including Senator Nelson Aldrich and Morgan's top associates, boarded a private railcar under false names, and traveled to a remote resort on Jekyll Island, Georgia. For 9 days, they mapped out a plan to centralize credit creation without calling it a central bank. The result was the Federal Reserve System, passed quietly by Congress in 1913. It looked democratic. 12 regional reserve banks overseen by a board in Washington. But ownership of those regional banks belonged to the very private banks they were meant to regulate. And the real power, the power to create money, rested in one mechanism: open market operations. Here's how it worked. When the U.S. Treasury needed funds, it issued bonds. The Federal Reserve bought those bonds not with stored gold or tax revenue, but with newly created credit. Numbers typed into the banking system. That credit became deposits in the Treasury's account. The government then spent it into the economy: wages, contracts, projects, and those dollars circulated like real money. Every bond purchase expanded the money supply. Every repayment required new borrowing to avoid contraction. Debt had become self-replicating. By 1929, this new system had fueled the Roaring Twenties: easy credit, booming stocks, and unstoppable optimism. Then the crash came. When asset values collapsed, the same mechanism that had expanded the economy now crushed it in reverse. But the principle survived. In every crisis afterward, from the Great Depression to the financial meltdown of 2008, the Federal Reserve repeated the same formula: print money, buy bonds, stabilize confidence. By 2023, the Fed held more than $7.4 trillion in U.S. government debt, nearly 1/5 of the total. The infinite credit engine that J.P. Morgan helped design now underwrites every dollar in circulation. Morgan died the same year the Fed was born, but his creation lives on. A machine that conjures liquidity from debt, ensures that government borrowing never ends, and keeps the global economy spinning by expanding the balance sheet of history itself. By the late 1970s, the machine was overheating. The Vietnam War, oil shocks, and relentless borrowing had driven inflation above 13% in the United States. The dollar was losing credibility abroad. Then one man stepped forward to break inflation, even if it broke the world. His name was Paul Volcker, chairman of the Federal Reserve. In 1979, he raised the federal funds rate from 11% to 20%, the highest in American history. Borrowing costs doubled, mortgage rates hit 18%. Factories closed, unemployment soared past 10%, and the U.S. entered its deepest recession since the 1930s. But inflation collapsed. Within 2 years, prices stabilized, and the dollar surged in value. On Wall Street, Volcker became a legend, the man who saved the currency. Yet his cure came with a global side effect. Throughout the 1970s, developing nations had borrowed heavily in U.S. dollars to build infrastructure, expecting cheap interest rates to last. When Volcker's hikes hit, those loans tripled in cost overnight. By 1982, Mexico owed $80 billion, Brazil $60 billion, and Argentina $40 billion. And their export revenues couldn't even cover the interest. In August 1982, Mexico announced it could no longer pay. Panic spread through international markets. American banks, Citibank, Bank of America, Chase Manhattan, faced catastrophic losses. Volcker had a choice: allow defaults that might bring down the U.S. financial system or keep the money flowing. He chose the latter. Through the International Monetary Fund, he organized what became known as structural adjustment loans. The IMF would lend new money to debtor nations so they could keep paying interest to Western banks, but with conditions. Those conditions demanded austerity: cut public spending, privatize state assets, devalue the currency, open domestic markets to foreign investors. The debts weren't forgiven. They were restructured, rolled over again and again to maintain the flow of payments. It was a brilliant design. Governments stayed solvent, banks stayed profitable, and entire nations were quietly bound into a permanent cycle of repayment. By the end of the decade, over 70 countries were trapped in what economists now call the debt crisis of the 1980s. In the years that followed, the same pattern reappeared. In Greece, 2010, Argentina, 2001, Sri Lanka, 2022. Different names, same medicine, new loans to pay old interest. Volcker called it discipline. Critics called it debt colonialism, economic sovereignty traded for survival. But whatever the name, it made the system global and self-sustaining. Paterson had made debt permanent. Rothschild made it international. Morgan made it infinite. And Volcker made it inescapable. By the dawn of the 21st century, the machine built by Paterson, Rothschild, Morgan, and Volcker had gone global. Every government borrowed, every corporation leveraged, and every citizen lived inside a web of credit backed by nothing but faith. Then, in 2008, faith collapsed. The U.S. housing bubble burst. Banks that had bundled trillions in mortgage-backed securities discovered those assets were nearly worthless. Within weeks, credit markets froze. Lehman Brothers fell. The same system that had financed prosperity threatened to erase it overnight. The rescue that followed was unlike anything in financial history. Instead of letting the market clear, central banks created new money electronically to buy failing assets and government bonds. They called it quantitative easing, QE. Here's how it worked. The U.S. Treasury issued bonds to finance stimulus spending. The Federal Reserve bought those bonds with digital credits it created from nothing. Those credits appeared as new deposits in commercial banks. The banks used them as reserves to issue more loans. Every purchase expanded the money supply, every loan multiplied it. Between 2008 and 2022, the world's central banks injected over $25 trillion into the global financial system. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet exploded from $900 billion to more than $8 trillion. The European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, and the People's Bank of China followed suit. Markets rebounded. Stocks hit record highs. Housing prices surged again. But underneath, the same debt engine simply changed gears. Instead of the governments borrowing from banks, now banks borrowed from governments, using those same government bonds as collateral. The line between money and IOU vanished entirely. By 2024, U.S. interest payments alone exceeded $1 trillion a year, more than the entire defense budget. Globally, debt service costs passed $8 trillion, and the largest asset managers, BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, collectively managed over $25 trillion, roughly 1/4 of global GDP, much of it invested in the very government debt taxpayers fund. QE had done its job. It prevented collapse, but it also made the system dependent on constant expansion. If central banks stopped buying, markets would fall. If governments stopped borrowing, money itself would contract. The illusion of stability now required infinite motion. Every crisis would be met with more liquidity, every recession with more debt. And the longer the machine ran, the harder it became to turn off. Here lies the paradox at the core of modern civilization. If all debt were repaid, the world's money would disappear. That's because almost 90% of all money today exists as digital credit created through lending. When banks issue loans, they create deposits. When those loans are repaid, the deposits vanish. The only way to keep money circulating is to keep borrowing. Every modern dollar begins its life as someone's liability. Government bonds create base money. Corporate bonds and mortgages expand it. Credit cards and consumer loans sustain it. If borrowing slows, economic output contracts, unemployment rises, and governments respond the only way they can, by issuing more debt. It's a closed circuit. Debt creates money. Money requires debt. Central banks can tighten or loosen the flow, but they can't replace the mechanism itself without erasing the money it produces. Imagine the economy as a body. Debt is the blood, interest the pulse. Every payment keeps circulation alive. Every attempt to drain it risks cardiac arrest. That's why global debt now exceeds $315 trillion, about 3 times total world GDP. It can't be paid off without collapsing the money supply by 2/3. The system's logic is simple but merciless. As long as nations grow, they must borrow. As long as they borrow, they must pay interest. And as long as interest flows, the machine endures. In this design, even collapse is profitable. Recessions trigger bailouts. Bailouts create new bonds. New bonds create new money. Technology has only accelerated it. Algorithmic trading and digital currencies now move trillions in milliseconds. The feedback loop that once took years now completes in seconds. It's the same 1694 engine, running at the speed of light. If it ever stopped, credit would evaporate, markets would freeze, and the global economy would seize like an engine without oil. Debt isn't merely a policy, it's the oxygen of the system. That's why no matter how much we owe, the world can never truly go broke. It just keeps borrowing to breathe. Every empire has its tribute. In ours, it isn't soldiers collecting coins. It's bankers collecting interest. Every year, the United States transfers over $1 trillion in interest from taxpayers to bondholders. Globally, that figure exceeds $8 trillion, the single largest recurring transfer of wealth in human history. And yet most people never see it happen. The system hides in plain sight. When you pay